FBI Special Agent Tara Johnson, a powerful and resilient black woman, faces a harrowing encounter with a corrupt officer, Daniels, who pulls her over on false pretenses. What begins as a routine stop spirals into a terrifying abuse of power, as Daniels refuses to recognize her authority and pushes her into a fight for survival. As Tara fights back against systemic racism and corruption, she must rely on her training and wits to survive and bring Daniels to justice. In this gripping tale of justice, power, and survival, will Tara outsmart the officer and make it out alive, or will she become another victim of police corruption? It was a warm afternoon in the busy city of Atlanta, and FBI Special Agent Tara Johnson was driving back to her office. Tara, a brilliant and highly respected black woman, had just wrapped up an intense meeting with her team. For months, she had been tracking down a dangerous drug cartel, and now, she was on the verge of a major breakthrough. The pressure was immense, but Tara thrived under it. She had fought her way up in a predominantly white, male-dominated agency, and every small victory in her career felt like a testament to her resilience. As Tara drove through the city streets, her mind replayed the latest intel from the investigation. Everything was falling into place, and the cartel's leader was closer than ever to being brought to justice. But as she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, flashing blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Surprised, Tara glanced at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Confused, she pulled over, wondering what this could be about. Behind her, a police car pulled up, and out stepped a tall, stern-looking officer. His hand rested on his gun holster as he approached her window. Tara rolled down her window, keeping calm. She reached for her FBI badge, ready to explain who she was. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" she asked politely. The officer, whose name tag read Daniels, barely acknowledged her greeting. His tone was cold, almost dismissive, as he barked, "License and registration." Taken aback, Tara held out her badge, explaining that she was a federal agent on duty. Daniels glanced at it for only a second before repeating his demand. Tara's stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. She had dealt with difficult cops before, but there was something different about Officer Daniels. His dismissive attitude and refusal to acknowledge her status as a federal agent set off alarm bells. "Officer, I'm complying, but I need you to understand that I'm on official duty," she said, trying to keep the situation calm. But instead of de-escalating, Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Tara hesitated, knowing she hadn't done anything wrong, but the situation was spiraling quickly out of control. The tension in the air was thick, and Tara could sense this was more than just a routine stop. The street was growing quieter as more people passed by, some slowing down to watch the scene unfold. Tara could feel their eyes on her, but no one intervened. With every passing second, the encounter became more intense. Daniel's voice rose as he repeated his demand, this time louder. "I said, step out of the vehicle." Reluctantly, Tara complied. She knew she had to remain calm. She had been trained for high-stress situations like this, but something about Daniels made her feel a different kind of threat, one that wasn't just about law enforcement but also carried an ugly undercurrent of racism. As she stepped out of the car, Daniels roughly grabbed her arm and shoved her against the vehicle. "Hey, what are you doing?" Tara protested, her voice shaking with disbelief. Daniels sneered, tightening his grip on her wrist. "Resisting arrest now, huh? You think you can flash your badge and do whatever you want," he growled, twisting her arm behind her back as he slapped handcuffs on her wrists. Tara winced in pain. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. As a federal agent, she had handled cases far more serious than this, but now she was being humiliated in broad daylight, simply because Officer Daniels refused to recognize her authority, or maybe it was because of something more. The handcuffs bit into Tara's wrists, the cold metal digging into her skin as Daniels dragged her toward his patrol car. "You're making a mistake," Tara said, her voice firm but trembling with anger. Daniels ignored her, his grip tightening as he shoved her into the back seat. From the safety of their distance, people were watching. Some filmed the scene on their phones, but no one stepped forward to help. Tara could feel her face burning with a mix of embarrassment and fury, but she held her head high. She knew she had done nothing wrong, and she wasn't going to let this officer break her spirit. Daniels looked back at her through the rearview mirror, a smug grin creeping across his face. "You think you're special, don't you? Just because you're FBI," he scoffed. "Well, let me tell you something, you're not above the law." Tara's mind raced as they pulled away from the curb. This was more than just an arrest. This was about power. Daniels was asserting his dominance, making it clear that he saw her as less than him, and he was using his authority to put her in her place. But Tara wasn't someone who gave up easily. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the patrol car sped through the streets, Tara tried to compose herself. She had been through countless tough situations in her career, but this felt different. There was a personal edge to Daniel's actions that she couldn't ignore. Was it because she was a black woman? Or was it simply because he thought he could get away with it? Either way, it didn't matter now. What mattered was figuring out how to get out of this situation without making it worse. She considered her options. Should she call for backup? Should she file a formal complaint? The tight handcuffs made it impossible to reach her phone, but Tara knew that someone from her team would eventually notice her absence. Her FBI colleagues would back her up, but how long would it take for them to realize something was wrong? Daniel's voice cut through her thoughts. "You really thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Pretending to be FBI." Tara's anger flared. "I'm not pretending. I am a federal agent, and you're making a huge mistake." But Daniels just chuckled, shaking his head. He didn't believe her, or maybe he didn't care. Either way, Tara knew she was in for a long fight, and it was one she couldn't afford to lose. The car came to a stop in front of a small, run-down police station. It wasn't one of the larger, more familiar precincts in the city. This station seemed older, less used. Tara's heart sank as she realized why Daniels had brought her here. This wasn't about processing an arrest. He had taken her away from the main precincts, likely to avoid any attention from her FBI colleagues or higher-ups. Daniels yanked open the door and pulled her out roughly. "Let's go, agent," he sneered, emphasizing the word as if it was a joke. Tara winced as he shoved her toward the entrance of the station. Inside, the atmosphere was eerily quiet. A few officers looked up briefly as Daniels led Tara past the front desk, but none of them seemed surprised by what they saw. No one reacted. Tara's stomach twisted with the chilling realization that this kind of behavior was normal here, expected even. She was alone in this. Daniels pushed her into a small, dimly lit interrogation room and slammed the door behind them. He began pacing back and forth in front of her, his expression cold and emotionless. "I don't care who you think you are," he said. "As far as I'm concerned, you're just another criminal." Tara met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "You're violating my rights," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "And when this is over, you'll regret it." Daniels leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "Is that a threat, Agent Johnson?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Tara didn't flinch. "It's a promise." Daniels stood up straight, smirking at Tara's defiant words. "A promise, huh? You're not in a position to make threats," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He turned and walked to the door, leaning against it casually, as if daring Tara to try something. Tara sat at the small, metal table, her wrists still bound by the tight cuffs. Her mind raced, trying to figure out her next move. The fact that she was in this small, run-down police station spoke volumes. Daniels didn't want attention. He wanted to isolate her, to make sure no one knew what was happening. Tara's training told her that she needed to keep her calm and look for an opportunity. Daniels returned to the table, slamming a file down in front of her. "You know what your problem is, Agent Johnson? You think that badge gives you power, makes you untouchable. But you're not special. Here, in this town, I make the rules. And right now, you're on my turf." His sneer deepened as he flipped open the file. Tara leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want, Daniels? What's your endgame here?" Daniels' smirk faltered for just a second. It was clear he wasn't used to being questioned. "My endgame," he said, recovering quickly. "I don't have to explain myself to you." But Tara had seen the hesitation in his eyes. She knew there was more to this than just a traffic stop gone wrong. This was about something deeper, something personal. And she was determined to figure it out. As Daniels continued to pace, there was a knock on the door. Another officer entered, this one younger and visibly uncomfortable. His badge read Officer Mitchell. He seemed hesitant, almost nervous, as he glanced at Daniels, then at Tara. I was told to process her," Mitchell stammered, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Daniels shot him a glare, the tension between them palpable. "Do your job, Mitchell," Daniels growled. "But don't forget who's in charge here." Mitchell nodded quickly and moved toward Tara. He unlocked her handcuffs, his hands trembling slightly as he did so. As their eyes met, Tara sensed something in him, doubt, maybe even guilt. Mitchell seemed different from Daniels, less confident in his role, as though he wasn't fully on board with what was happening. "Officer Mitchell," Tara said quietly, keeping her voice low. "You know this isn't right. You don't have to go along with it." Mitchell paused, glancing nervously at the door where Daniels stood watching. "I don't make the rules," he muttered under his breath, avoiding her gaze. Tara leaned in slightly, her voice firm but soft. "You don't have to follow them either, not when they're wrong." For a brief moment, Mitchell's eyes met hers again, and Tara could see the conflict in his expression. But before he could respond, Daniels stepped forward, his presence casting a shadow over the room. "Enough," Daniels snapped. "Process her and get her into holding." Mitchell swallowed hard and nodded, leading Tara out of the interrogation room. As they walked down the hallway, Tara whispered to him, "You have a choice, Mitchell. You don't have to be part of this." Mitchell hesitated again, his steps slowing as they approached the holding cells. I'll figure something out," he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. Tara's heart pounded in her chest as he locked her inside the cell. She knew she was running out of time. If Daniels got his way, this situation could get much worse. But she had seen a glimmer of hope in Mitchell's hesitation. Maybe, just maybe, he could be an ally in all this. Hours passed, and Tara found herself sitting alone in the cold, dimly lit holding cell. She had been in tough situations before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about survival, it was about her dignity, her rights, and standing up against the systemic abuse of power. She couldn't stop thinking about Mitchell. He was young, inexperienced, and clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. If she could just get through to him, maybe he could help her. But she also knew she couldn't rely solely on that hope. She needed to be proactive. As the minutes ticked by, Tara's mind raced with possibilities. She knew her colleagues at the FBI would eventually realize she was missing, but how long would that take? And even then, would they be able to connect the dots to where she was being held? The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Tara from her thoughts. It was Mitchell, and he looked more anxious than ever. He glanced around nervously before unlocking her cell door. "I'm getting you out of here," he whispered. Tara's heart raced. Was this a trap, or had she actually reached him? She didn't have time to think about it. She knew she had to take the chance. She nodded and followed him out of the cell, moving quickly and quietly down the hallway. As they reached the back exit of the station, Mitchell stopped, turning to face her. "You need to leave, now. Daniels, he's not going to let this go." Tara looked at him, her heart pounding. "Why are you doing this?" Mitchell hesitated, his face pale with anxiety. "Because it's wrong," he muttered. "What Daniels is doing, it's illegal, and it's going to come back on him. But if you stay here, you're the one who's going to suffer." Tara nodded, her mind spinning with questions. Could she trust him? Was this just another part of Daniel's plan? But she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had to act, and she had to act now. With one last look at Mitchell, Tara slipped out the door and into the night, the cool air hitting her face like a wave of relief. But she knew this was far from over. Daniels wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. And now, it was up to her to bring him down. Tara sprinted through the quiet streets, her heart pounding as the adrenaline coursed through her veins. The night air was cool against her skin, but she barely noticed. All that mattered now was putting as much distance between herself and that station as possible. Every step echoed in the stillness of the night, and her mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next. Behind her, the police station stood like a looming reminder of the corruption she was up against. Daniels was no longer just a rogue cop, he was a man with power, influence, and connections, and Tara knew that he wouldn't rest until he had her back in custody, or worse. The city streets blurred past her as she ducked into a side alley, her pulse quickening with every turn. She had to stay hidden, to disappear, at least for a while, until she could figure out her next move. Mitchell had taken a huge risk helping her, but she knew that he wasn't enough. She needed backup. She needed to contact someone from the FBI who could bring this all to light. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. Panic surged through her chest. Was it Daniels? Had he already found her? She pressed herself against the brick wall of a building, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as she listened carefully. The footsteps grew louder, and then they stopped. Tara's heart raced as she peeked around the corner, only to see a man walking his dog, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding just blocks away. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. She had to keep moving. Tara moved swiftly through the back streets, heading toward a safe house she had used in the past. It wasn't far, just on the outskirts of the city, and it was her best option for now. She could regroup there, gather her thoughts, and figure out how to bring Daniels down. As she approached the small, nondescript building, she felt a sense of relief. But that relief was quickly replaced by a sinking feeling in her stomach. What if Daniels had already anticipated this? What if he had people watching the safe house? She knew she had to be careful. There was no room for mistakes now. Inside the safe house, Tara paced the small living room, her mind racing. She had managed to escape, but for how long? Daniels would come after her, and she needed to be ready. She couldn't sit here and wait for him to strike. She grabbed a burner phone from a drawer and quickly dialed the number of the one person she knew she could trust, Agent Jackson. He was a colleague at the FBI, someone she had worked with for years, and someone who owed her a favor. If anyone could help her, it was him. The phone rang once, twice, and then Jackson's voice came through the line. "Tara? What's going on?" Tara exhaled, the sound of his voice providing a small sense of comfort. "I'm in trouble, Jackson." "Big trouble. What happened?" Jackson asked, his tone immediately serious. "I was pulled over by a cop, Daniels. He's corrupt, Jackson. He arrested me for no reason, and now he's trying to cover it up. I managed to get out, but I'm still in danger. I need backup." Jackson was silent for a moment before responding. "Where are you now?" "I'm at the safe house on the west side of town," Tara said. "But I don't know how long I can stay here. Daniels is dangerous, and he won't stop until he gets to me." "Stay put," Jackson said firmly. "I'll send a team, but you need to stay low until they get there. Daniels won't go down without a fight." Tara nodded, though she knew Jackson couldn't see her. "I'll wait, but we need to move fast. He's got the whole department in his pocket, and he's not afraid to use it." As she hung up the phone, Tara's mind raced with the possibilities. She trusted Jackson, but even with his help, taking down Daniels wouldn't be easy. This was bigger than just one corrupt cop. This was about an entire system that allowed people like Daniels to thrive. Just as she was about to sit down, there was a knock at the door. Tara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could it be? No one was supposed to know she was here. Slowly, she moved toward the door, peeking through the small window. Her stomach dropped when she saw who it was, Officer Mitchell. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around as if he expected Daniels to show up at any moment. Tara hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low and tense. Mitchell glanced over his shoulder before stepping inside. "I couldn't just leave you," he said, his voice filled with anxiety. "Daniels is on to you, and I think he knows you're here." Tara's heart raced. "How does he know?" Mitchell shook his head. "I don't know for sure, but he's got people looking for you. You're not safe here." Tara's mind raced as she considered her options. She couldn't stay in the safe house, but she also couldn't go back on the run. She needed to come up with a plan, and fast. "We need to move," she said, grabbing her bag. "But we can't just run. We need to bring Daniels down, and for that, I need evidence." Mitchell's face paled. "Evidence?" "Daniels covers his tracks. There's no way to prove what he's done." "There's always a way," Tara said, her voice firm. "We just have to find it." As they left the safe house, Tara and Mitchell moved quickly through the darkened streets, keeping a low profile. They needed to act fast if they were going to find the evidence they needed to expose Daniels. Tara's mind was already working overtime, piecing together the information she had gathered so far. Daniels had been careful, but no one was perfect. There had to be a paper trail, something that linked him to his corrupt activities. And if there wasn't, she would make sure to create one. "We need to get back into the station," Tara said as they ducked into an alleyway to avoid a passing patrol car. "There has to be something in Daniel's files, something that proves what he's been doing." Mitchell looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Are you crazy? If Daniels catches us, we're both dead." Tara's eyes were filled with determination. "I'm not going to let him win, Mitchell. This is bigger than me, bigger than both of us. If we don't stop him, he'll keep doing this to other people. He'll keep getting away with it." Mitchell hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. Let's do it." As they moved toward the station, Tara's heart raced with both fear and determination. The stakes were higher than ever, but she knew she couldn't back down. Daniels had to be stopped, and she was the only one who could do it. And as they approached the station, the weight of what lay ahead settled heavily on her shoulders. There was no turning back now. The real fight was just beginning. Tara and Mitchell approached the police station under the cover of night, the oppressive weight of what they were about to attempt hanging over them. The station, normally a symbol of justice and safety, now felt like a fortress of corruption. Tara's heart raced as she considered the risks. One misstep, and Daniels would not only catch them, he would make sure they never had another chance to expose him. Mitchell looked more nervous than ever. His hands trembled as they moved through the back alley leading to the rear entrance of the station. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered, his eyes darting nervously around. Tara nodded, keeping her voice low but firm. "We don't have a choice. We need to get to Daniel's office. He's bound to have something, documents, files, anything that ties him to the corruption." Mitchell swallowed hard. "And if we get caught?" "We won't," Tara said, though she wasn't entirely sure. "Stick to the plan, and we'll be out before anyone notices." They slipped through the back door, moving quickly but carefully down the dimly lit hallways of the station. Tara had been in plenty of high-stakes situations before, but this was different. She was going up against someone within the system she had sworn to protect, someone who knew how to manipulate the law and twist it to his advantage. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. She couldn't. As they approached Daniel's office, Tara motioned for Mitchell to stop. She peeked around the corner, her heart pounding in her chest. The office door was closed, but there were no signs of anyone around. For now, they were in the clear. "Wait here," Tara whispered to Mitchell. "I'll go in and search. Keep an eye out for anyone coming." Mitchell nodded, standing guard as Tara moved silently to the office door. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small lock-picking tool, a skill she had learned early on in her FBI career. Within moments, the lock clicked open, and she slipped inside. The office was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the blinds. Tara moved quickly, her eyes scanning the room for anything that might give them the evidence they needed. Daniels was careful, she knew that, but no one could hide everything. She rifled through the drawers of his desk, finding little more than standard paperwork. Her frustration grew with every passing second. There had to be something, anything, that linked Daniels to his illegal activities. Then, she spotted it. A small locked drawer at the bottom of the desk. It was different from the others, more secure. Tara's pulse quickened as she knelt down, her lock-picking tool in hand. She worked quickly, her mind racing. If this was what she thought it was, they might finally have the proof they needed. The lock clicked open, and Tara pulled the drawer out. Inside was a single manila folder, its edges worn from use. She flipped it open, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned the documents inside. It was all there, financial records, bribes, even blackmail material Daniels had used to keep others in line. This was it. This was the smoking gun. Tara quickly gathered the documents, stuffing them into her bag. Just as she stood up, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Her heart raced. Someone was coming. She rushed to the door, peeking through the crack. It was Daniels. His figure loomed in the hallway, his heavy footsteps getting closer. Tara turned to Mitchell, who was frozen in place, fear etched across his face. She waved for him to follow her, mouthing the words, "We need to go." But it was too late. Daniels had spotted them. "What the hell are you doing?" Daniels' voice boomed down the hallway, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. Tara felt a cold chill run down her spine. There was no way out now. "Run!" Tara shouted to Mitchell as she darted down the hallway, her feet pounding against the cold tile floor. Mitchell followed close behind, but Tara could hear Daniel's footsteps right on their heels. They burst through the rear exit, the cool night air hitting them like a wave. Tara's heart raced as they sprinted toward the parking lot, but she knew Daniels wouldn't let them get far. They had to get out of here, and fast. Just as they reached the edge of the parking lot, Tara heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "Stop right there!" Daniels shouted, his voice filled with venom. Tara and Mitchell skidded to a halt, turning slowly to face him. Daniels stood there, his gun pointed directly at them, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and satisfaction. "You think you can outsmart me?" Daniels sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "You're finished." Tara's mind raced. They were trapped, and Daniels had them right where he wanted them. But she wasn't going down without a fight. "Let me explain, Daniels," Tara said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "This doesn't have to end like this." Daniels laughed, a cold, bitter sound. You really think you have a chance here? You've been digging into things you don't understand, and now it's time to pay the price. But before Tara could respond, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. A black SUV skidded into the parking lot, its headlights blinding in the darkness. The door flew open, and Jackson stepped out, his gun drawn. "Drop the weapon, Daniels," Jackson shouted, his voice commanding and full of authority. "It's over." Daniels hesitated, his eyes flickering between Tara and Jackson. For a moment, Tara thought he might actually lower his gun. But then his face twisted into a snarl, and he raised the weapon higher. Tara didn't wait. With lightning reflexes, she lunged at Daniels, knocking the gun from his hand and sending it skidding across the pavement. The two of them struggled, but Tara's training kicked in. Within seconds, she had him pinned to the ground, her knee pressed firmly against his back. Jackson rushed over, handcuffing Daniels as he struggled beneath Tara's weight. "It's over," Tara whispered, her breath ragged. "You're done." Daniels glared up at her, his face twisted with hatred. But Tara didn't care. She had won. For now. Back at the FBI office, Tara sat across from Jackson, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing heavily on her shoulders. The evidence they had gathered from Daniels' office was enough to bring him down, but it hadn't been easy. Daniels had been careful, but in the end, his arrogance had been his downfall. "You did good," Jackson said, his voice calm but full of respect. "We'll get him processed and make sure this never happens again." Tara nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to come. Daniels was in custody, but the system that had allowed him to thrive was still very much intact. And as long as that system existed, there would always be another Daniels. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Jackson stood up, patting her on the shoulder. "Get some rest, Tara. You've earned it." But as Jackson walked away, Tara knew that rest was the last thing on her mind. There was still work to be done, and she wasn't going to stop until the entire system was brought to justice. As she left the office that night, the city lights flickered in the distance, a reminder of the corruption that still lurked in the shadows. And Tara Johnson was ready to take it all down. Tara sat at her desk, the dim light of her office casting shadows on the stacks of paperwork and case files scattered before her. She was far from celebrating. Daniels' arrest was just the tip of the iceberg. The corrupt officers who had turned a blind eye to his behavior and the larger network that allowed his abuse of power were still out there, lurking in the background. The silence that had once protected him would now have to be broken. Jackson entered the room, his usual air of calm determination even more pronounced today. "I've been going through the files you retrieved from Daniels' office," he said, tossing a folder on her desk. "There's more to this than just him." Tara opened the folder and skimmed through the pages. Financial records, names, and transactions, each piece pointing to something far bigger than Daniels. It wasn't just one bad cop. There was an entire system of corruption, one that reached deep into law enforcement, politicians, and even local businesses. "They're all connected," Tara said, her voice low but steady. "Daniels was just the face of it, but this goes deeper." Jackson nodded. "We've already started pulling in some of the names listed in the files. So far, no one's talking. But we'll keep pressing." Tara leaned back in her chair, the weight of the task ahead settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had expected resistance. People in power rarely gave it up without a fight. But as she thought about the lives that had been ruined by this network of corruption, she knew she couldn't back down. The victims, the ones who had been silenced or pushed aside, deserved justice. "I'll start working through these files, too," Tara said, her fingers tracing the edges of the papers. "There has to be a way to connect them all, to expose everything." Jackson gave her a long look, admiration flickering in his eyes. "Just don't push yourself too hard, Tara. This fight isn't going to be over quickly." Tara nodded but said nothing. She knew Jackson was right, but this was her battle now. And she wasn't going to stop until every last one of them was brought to justice. The next few days passed in a blur of long hours and relentless digging. Tara spent every waking moment sifting through the documents from Daniels' office, piecing together the network of bribes, cover-ups, and intimidation tactics that had protected the corrupt officers in the precinct for years. The deeper she dug, the more she realized just how far-reaching the corruption was. But there was one name that kept popping up in the files: Hector Ramos, a powerful businessman with ties to politicians and law enforcement. Rumors had always whirled around Ramos, but no one had ever been able to pin anything on him. He was careful, always staying just out of reach. "He's the key," Tara muttered to herself as she stared at his name on the screen. "If we can take down Ramos, the whole network will collapse. But getting to him wouldn't be easy." Ramos was connected to some of the most powerful people in the city, and any attempt to go after him would be met with fierce resistance. Tara needed more than just evidence. She needed someone on the inside, someone who knew Ramos' operations from the ground level. That's when she remembered David Mack, a former associate of Ramos who had fallen out of favor and was now serving time for a minor charge. Mack had once been Ramos' right-hand man, but after a series of disagreements, he had been cut off and left to fend for himself. If anyone knew Ramos' secrets, it was Mack. Tara made the call and arranged for a meeting with Mack at the prison where he was being held. As she walked into the sterile visitation room, Mack was already waiting for her, his face a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Tara Johnson," Mack said with a smirk as he leaned back in his chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need information," Tara said, cutting straight to the point. "About Hector Ramos. You used to work for him, so you know how he operates. I need you to help me bring him down." Mack's smirk widened. "You've got some guts coming here asking for my help, especially after what happened between me and Ramos. What makes you think I'll talk?" "Because Ramos left you to rot," Tara replied, her voice steady. "He used you until you were no longer useful, and now you're sitting here while he's still out there, living large. You help me, and I can make sure you get something in return." Mack's eyes flickered with interest, but he still hesitated. "And what exactly are you offering?" "Your freedom," Tara said, leaning in closer. "I can help reduce your sentence. But you have to give me something solid, something that'll put Ramos away for good." Mack was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying Tara carefully. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll help. But you better be ready for what's coming. Ramos isn't going down without a fight, and he's got people everywhere. Once you start this, there's no turning back." Tara knew he was right. Going after Ramos would put her in the crosshairs of some of the most dangerous people in the city. But she had come too far to stop now. "I'm ready," Tara said, her voice firm. "Tell me what you know." Mack's information was more valuable than Tara could have imagined. He laid out Ramos' entire operation, how he funneled money through shell companies, paid off cops to look the other way, and even had judges in his pocket. It was the kind of corruption that made Tara's blood boil, but it also gave her a way in. Armed with the new intel, Tara began building her case against Ramos, pulling in Jackson and a select few agents she trusted to help. They worked in secret, knowing that any leak could tip off Ramos or his associates and jeopardize the entire operation. But even with the evidence stacking up, Tara knew they needed more. They needed to catch Ramos in the act, to have undeniable proof that could withstand the inevitable pushback from his powerful allies. That's when Mack came to her with a dangerous proposition. "There's a meeting happening next week," Mack said, his voice low as they spoke in a secured location. "Ramos is meeting with some of his top people to discuss a new deal. If you can get in there and record the conversation, you'll have everything you need to take him down." Tara's heart raced at the thought. Infiltrating a meeting with Ramos and his inner circle was a high-risk move, but it was also the only way to get the proof they needed. "How do I get in?" Tara asked. Mack grinned. "I've still got a few favors left with some of his guys. I'll get you in. But once you're there, you're on your own." Tara nodded, the weight of the decision settling over her. This was it. The moment that could make or break the entire investigation. If she succeeded, Ramos would go down, and the web of corruption would unravel. But if she failed, she would be walking into a lion's den with no way out. "I'll do it," Tara said, her voice steady. "Set it up." Mack's grin faded, replaced by a look of respect. "You've got guts, Agent Johnson. Let's hope it's enough." The days leading up to the meeting felt like a blur. Tara spent every waking moment preparing for what would be the most dangerous operation of her career. She knew going undercover in Hector Ramos' world was a gamble, but it was the only way to get what she needed. With Mack's help, she was given a new identity, Melissa Warren, a low-level business associate with a fabricated background that tied her to one of Ramos' shell companies. The night of the meeting arrived sooner than Tara expected. She found herself standing in front of a full-length mirror, adjusting her sleek, dark attire. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore minimal makeup, trying to appear as inconspicuous as possible while still blending in with the high-end crowd Ramos surrounded himself with. Hidden beneath her jacket was a wire, carefully secured and tested to ensure it would capture everything. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the stakes. The moment she stepped into that room, she'd be surrounded by dangerous criminals, any one of them capable of sniffing her out if she made a wrong move. But fear wasn't an option. Jackson had checked in with her earlier in the evening. He wasn't thrilled about her going in alone, but they both knew it was the only way. If too many people were involved, it would raise suspicion, and Ramos would never show his hand. Tara pulled up to the location, a private, luxury high-rise in the heart of the city. The kind of place where the wealthy held their secret deals, far from the prying eyes of law enforcement. As she exited the car, she could feel the tension settling in her chest, but she pushed it down. She had a job to do. A tall, broad-shouldered man, who must have been one of Ramos' security, stood by the door as she approached. He eyed her up and down before giving a curt nod. "Miss Warren, you're expected," he said in a low, gravelly voice, stepping aside to let her in. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but refined. Soft jazz played in the background, and the lights were dim, casting long shadows across the room. The meeting was taking place in a private suite on the top floor. As Tara stepped into the elevator, her heart began to race. She checked the wire one last time, praying it wouldn't malfunction. There would be no second chances if it did. The elevator doors opened to reveal a lavish penthouse suite, filled with sleek furniture and an expansive view of the city below. But what drew her attention was the group of men gathered around a large conference table in the center of the room. And there, seated at the head, was Hector Ramos. Ramos was every bit as intimidating in person as Tara had imagined. He was in his mid-50s, with slicked-back silver hair and a sharp, calculating gaze. He wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the ease of a man who knew he was untouchable, or at least thought he was. The men surrounding him were just as dangerous, each one a key player in his criminal enterprise. "Miss Warren," Ramos said, his voice smooth and dangerous as he gestured for her to sit. "I've heard good things about you." Tara forced a smile as she took her seat, every muscle in her body tense. "Thank you. It's an honor to finally meet you." Ramos studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to figure her out. But then he smiled, a slow, almost predatory grin that sent a chill down her spine. "Let's get to business, shall we?" The meeting began, with Ramos and his associates discussing various deals, money laundering, drug trafficking, and political bribes. Tara listened carefully, making sure every word was picked up by the wire. But as the minutes passed, she realized that Ramos was careful not to implicate himself directly. He had built an empire on avoiding responsibility, always staying just out of reach of the law. Then, the conversation shifted. "I'm concerned about the investigation into the precinct," one of Ramos' associates said, his voice low. "They're getting too close." Ramos waved his hand dismissively. "Don't worry about it. I've got people inside keeping them distracted. They'll never connect it to us." Tara's heart raced. This was what she had been waiting for, confirmation that Ramos was pulling the strings, controlling the corrupt officers within the police department. But she needed more. She needed him to admit to something concrete. Still, another man chimed in, "Daniels was sloppy. That FBI agent, Johnson, she's digging deeper than we expected." Tara held her breath, her fingers clenched tightly in her lap. Ramos' expression darkened at the mention of her name. "Johnson is a problem," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But she won't be for long. I'm handling it." Tara's pulse quickened. Handling it? Was he planning something? She needed to push him, to get him to reveal more. But how? "With all due respect, Mr. Ramos," Tara said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, "it sounds like this Johnson woman could become a serious threat. Are we sure everything's under control?" Ramos' eyes flicked toward her, and for a moment, Tara thought she had overplayed her hand. But then, to her relief, he smirked. "Let me worry about Agent Johnson," he said. "She's already being taken care of. Just like Daniels." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. It was enough. Tara had what she needed. But she couldn't let Ramos know that. Not yet. The rest of the meeting passed without incident, but Tara's mind was spinning with the revelations she had just heard. As soon as the meeting ended, she made her way back to her car, trying to appear calm and collected. But as soon as she was out of sight, she pressed the button on her wire, sending the recorded audio straight to Jackson's team. They had enough to take Ramos down. Finally. But just as Tara started the engine, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Jackson. "We've got a problem. Get back to the office ASAP." Tara's stomach twisted in knots as she drove back to the FBI field office. What could have gone wrong? They had the evidence. Ramos would be behind bars within days. But when she arrived, Jackson's grim expression told her everything she needed to know. "There's been a leak," Jackson said, his voice tight with frustration. "Someone tipped Ramos off. He knows we're coming for him." Tara's blood ran cold. "What? How? Who could have?" "We don't know yet," Jackson interrupted. "But Ramos has already started covering his tracks. He's moving his assets, calling in favors. It's going to be a lot harder to get to him now." Tara sank into her chair, her mind reeling. They had been so close. How had this happened? "There's more," Jackson said, his voice low. "We think there's a mole in the FBI. Someone feeding Ramos information." Tara's heart sank. A mole? In the FBI? That would explain how Ramos had stayed one step ahead of them all this time. But who could it be? "We'll figure it out," Jackson said, his jaw set in determination. "But in the meantime, we need to move fast. Ramos is going to disappear if we don't act now." Tara nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. They were in a race against time, and the stakes had never been higher. Ramos knew they were coming, and now it was a matter of who would strike first. As Tara stood up, ready to dive back into the fray, one thought echoed in her mind: trust no one. The weight of the situation bore heavily on Tara's shoulders as she left the FBI office. The revelation that a mole was operating within the bureau changed everything. She had no idea who she could trust anymore. Every colleague, every superior could be the one tipping off Hector Ramos, keeping him one step ahead of the law. Driving through the dimly lit streets of Atlanta, Tara's mind raced. The mole had access to sensitive information, her case, her undercover operation, everything. If they were feeding details to Ramos, then not only was her mission at risk, but so was her life. She could almost feel the eyes watching her, the invisible threat looming over her every move. As she pulled up to her apartment, the familiar unease washed over her. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. Ramos wasn't just a criminal kingpin, he was calculated, ruthless, and now, thanks to the mole, he had the upper hand. Tara entered her apartment and locked the door behind her, instinctively checking every corner before settling in. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jackson: "Be careful. We're running down leads on the mole, but we're in the dark for now. You need to stay under the radar." Tara couldn't help but smirk at the irony. Staying under the radar was nearly impossible when the enemy had their eyes on you. She typed a quick response, thanking Jackson for the heads up, and then collapsed onto her couch, her mind swirling with thoughts. Just as she started to unwind, there was a loud knock at her door. Tara's heart leapt into her throat. She stood, moving cautiously toward the peephole. On the other side stood a familiar face, Agent Davis, one of her colleagues, a seasoned agent with years of experience. "Tara, it's Davis," he called from the hallway. "I need to talk to you." Tara hesitated. Trust no one, she reminded herself. But Davis had been her partner on several operations. He had always had her back. Still, with the mole situation, there was no way to be certain. She slowly unlocked the door, opening it just enough to peer through. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice firm but guarded. Davis glanced down the hall before stepping closer. "Jackson sent me. There's been a development with the mole," he said, his tone low and urgent. "We think we know who it is." Tara's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "Agent Wells," Davis replied without hesitation. "We traced a series of encrypted communications back to his workstation. Jackson is putting together a case, but we need to move fast. Wells could bolt any minute." Tara's mind reeled. Agent Wells had been with the Bureau for years. He was well-respected, competent. If he really was the mole, then they were in more danger than she had imagined. But something about Davis's demeanor made her pause. His urgency felt forced. "Jackson didn't mention this to me," Tara said slowly, watching Davis's reaction carefully. Davis shifted slightly, his eyes darting to the side before settling back on her. "He wanted to keep it quiet for now. Only a few of us know." We're meeting in the safe house to regroup before making a move. Tara's instincts flared. Something wasn't right. Davis was pushing too hard. She could feel the tension radiating from him, but it wasn't the kind of tension that came from fear of a mole. It was something darker, something she had seen before in suspects trying to cover their tracks. Davis, Tara said, her voice calm but sharp, I'm going to need you to come inside and have a seat. He blinked, surprised by her sudden shift in tone. What? We don't have time for. I said. Tara cut him off, come inside. Now. Davis hesitated, his expression hardening for a split second before he stepped into her apartment. He sat down, his eyes carefully watching her as she closed the door behind him. I'm not going anywhere with you until you tell me what's really going on, Tara said, crossing her arms. And if you lie to me, this is over. Davis let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. Tara, I'm telling you the truth. We think Wells is the mole. We have to move before he disappears. You know how dangerous this is. Tara tilted her head, studying him. You're right. It is dangerous. Especially since Wells isn't the mole, is he? Davis's expression faltered, just for a split second, but it was enough. Tara had seen the look of guilt on countless faces during interrogations. She knew the signs. I don't know what you're talking about, Davis said, his voice tightening. Tara stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. Davis, don't make this harder than it has to be. You think I wouldn't notice? You think I wouldn't piece it together? You've been feeding Ramos information from the start. Davis stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. Tara, you don't understand. It's not what you think. Then explain, she said, her voice cold and steady. Davis's face twisted with frustration. You don't get it. Ramos, he's not just some kingpin. He's got people everywhere, judges, cops, politicians. There's no beating him. The system is rigged. I was trying to protect myself. Tara felt her blood boil. By betraying your team? By betraying me? It wasn't supposed to go this far. Davis snapped. I didn't have a choice. Ramos would have killed me if I didn't cooperate. Tara shook her head, disgusted. You had a choice. You could have come to us. We could have helped you. But instead, you sold us out. Davis took a step toward her, his eyes desperate. I can still fix this, Tara. I can help you take him down. Just let me explain everything to Jackson. That's not going to happen, Tara said, pulling out her phone and dialing Jackson. This is over, Davis. As the phone rang, Davis's face fell. His shoulders slumped, and the weight of his decisions seemed to crash down on him all at once. He knew there was no way out now. Jackson answered on the first ring. Tara? What's going on? Tara glanced at Davis, her voice firm. I've got the mole. By the time Jackson and a team of agents arrived at Tara's apartment, Davis had given up any attempt to resist. He sat silently in the corner, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face a mixture of anger and regret. Tara stood by the window, her arms crossed as she watched Jackson's team secure Davis for transport. You did the right thing, Tara, Jackson said as he approached. We'll interrogate him back at the office. Get the full story. Tara nodded, but the knot in her stomach hadn't loosened. I should have seen it sooner. Davis was always there. Right in front of me. Don't beat yourself up, Jackson said, his tone reassuring. Moles are good at what they do. He fooled all of us. As Davis was led out of the apartment, Tara couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. Davis had been one of them. He had fought alongside her, taken on dangerous missions with her. And all that time, he had been working for Ramos, sabotaging their efforts from within. Jackson placed a hand on her shoulder. Get some rest, Tara. We'll handle this. Ramos won't see what's coming. But as the door closed behind Jackson and the others, Tara couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. Ramos was still out there, and now that his mole had been exposed, he would be even more dangerous. He would retaliate. And Tara knew, deep down, that she wasn't safe yet. As she stood alone in her apartment, the weight of everything pressed down on her. The investigation had turned personal. Ramos wasn't just a target, he was her enemy. And the battle against him was only beginning. Tara woke the next morning with a sense of unease lingering in the pit of her stomach. She knew that the fallout from Davis's betrayal would ripple through the bureau. There was no telling how much damage he had caused or how many people Ramos had compromised. But what worried her most was the question that haunted her thoughts: what would Ramos do now? She didn't have to wait long to find out. That afternoon, as she sat in a briefing with Jackson and the rest of the team, her phone buzzed. It was a message, no name, no number, just 3 words that sent a chill down her spine: "You're next, Johnson." Tara's blood ran cold. Ramos had made his move. Jackson noticed the change in her expression and raised an eyebrow. "Tara, what is it?" She showed him the message, her heart pounding in her chest. Jackson's jaw tightened as he read it, and the room went silent. "He's coming after you," Jackson said, his voice low and serious. "We need to get you into protective custody." Tara shook her head. "No. If Ramos is threatening me, it means we're close. He's getting desperate. I'm not running. We finish this." Jackson stared at her for a long moment before nodding. "All right. But we do this by the book. No more risks." Tara agreed, but deep down, she knew that nothing about this case was by the book anymore. Ramos had made it personal, and she was ready to take the fight to him. That night, Tara sat in her apartment, her mind racing as she thought about everything that had led her to this point. She knew that Ramos wouldn't stop until she was silenced. But she also knew that she wasn't going down without a fight. And as the city's lights flickered outside her window, Tara made a silent vow: "This ends with Ramos behind bars, or it ends with me." As Tara prepares to confront Hector Ramos, the stakes continue to rise. Each step brings new revelations, betrayals, and dangers as Tara fights to protect herself and her team from the ruthless drug kingpin. The line between justice and revenge blurs, and Tara must make difficult choices as she inches closer to the truth. Tara's instincts were sharp, honed by years of field experience, but as she moved through the streets of Atlanta, she felt the weight of being watched more than ever. Ramos had sent her a clear message: he wasn't done with her. And now, every shadow, every passerby, felt like a potential threat. She knew that Ramos had eyes everywhere, and it wouldn't take long for him to strike. After the threatening message, Jackson had increased the FBI's surveillance and protection around Tara, but she refused to be caged in by fear. She wanted to be proactive, to take the fight to Ramos. There was no way she would sit on the sidelines while this criminal continued to play games with her life and her team. That night, Tara sat in her office, combing through files, trying to connect the dots between Ramos and his mole, Davis. Something was off. Davis was too smart to leave breadcrumbs, but Ramos? Ramos always left a trail, intentionally or not. There was a pattern here. She just had to find it. As she sat at her desk, her phone buzzed again. She tensed, glancing at it, half expecting another threat from Ramos. But instead, it was from Jackson: "We've got something. Surveillance shows Ramos men moving in the docks tonight. We think there's going to be a shipment. We need you on this." Finally, a lead she could sink her teeth into. Tara grabbed her jacket and headed to the briefing room, where Jackson and the rest of the team were already gathered. "We've been monitoring Ramos' operations for weeks," Jackson began, pulling up surveillance footage. "We think tonight, he's moving a significant shipment through the docks. Could be drugs, could be weapons, we don't know for sure yet. But this is the break we've been waiting for." Tara nodded, focusing on the task at hand. "We need to cut off his supply chain. This could cripple his entire operation." "Exactly," Jackson agreed. "We're going in heavy. SWAT's ready, and we'll have agents posted at all key exits. We take him down tonight." As they finalized the plan, Tara felt a surge of adrenaline. She was ready to confront Ramos. He had eluded them for too long, but now, with this operation, they had a chance to hit him where it hurt. The team mobilized quickly, and within the hour, Tara found herself at the docks, the cold night air biting at her skin. The area was quiet, too quiet. The warehouses loomed like dark giants along the water's edge, their empty windows staring blankly into the night. Tara crouched behind a stack of crates, her hand resting on her sidearm as she scanned the area. "Keep your eyes open," Jackson's voice crackled through her earpiece. "We've got movement inside Warehouse B." Tara nodded and motioned for her team to follow her as they moved toward the building. The faint sound of voices echoed from inside, and her heart pounded as they reached the door. "Ready?" she whispered to the agents beside her. With a nod, they moved in, the door creaking open slowly. The warehouse was dimly lit, the shadows casting eerie shapes across the walls. Tara could make out several figures at the far end, gathered around crates, Ramos men, no doubt. They moved quickly, silently, positioning themselves for the takedown. Tara's pulse raced as she signaled for the team to move in. This was it. "FBI. Don't move," she shouted, her voice ringing out through the cavernous space. Chaos erupted. Ramos men scattered, some drawing weapons, others scrambling for the exits. Gunfire echoed through the warehouse as Tara and her team engaged, moving with precision and force. Tara's focus was sharp as she cornered one of the men, pinning him to the ground. "Where's Ramos?" she demanded, her voice cold and unwavering. The men sneered, blood trickling from his lip. "You'll never find him. He's always 2 steps ahead of you, Agent Johnson." Tara pressed the barrel of her gun harder against his temple. "You really want to test me right now? Where is he?" But the men only laughed, a chilling sound that sent a shiver down Tara's spine. "He's already won, Johnson. You just don't know it yet." Before she could react, a shot rang out from behind her. Tara spun around, her eyes wide with shock as one of Ramos' men collapsed to the ground, his gun falling from his hand. Jackson stood behind him, his gun still smoking. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning the area for any more threats. Tara nodded, her heart still racing. "Yeah. But this isn't over." They continued to sweep the area, arresting several more of Ramos' men and securing the shipment. But as the night dragged on, there was still no sign of Ramos. Tara's frustration grew. He was slipping through their fingers yet again. As the team gathered outside the warehouse, Jackson approached Tara, his expression grim. "We got most of his men, but no sign of Ramos." "He's playing us," Tara muttered, her jaw clenched in anger. "He knew we'd be here." Jackson nodded. "Looks like he's been tipped off." Again. Tara's mind raced. They had moved fast, but Ramos had been faster. There had to be another mole. Someone else feeding him information. "Damn it," Tara hissed under her breath. "He's still 1 step ahead." Jackson placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll get him, Tara. We're closing in. But you need to be careful. He's targeting you now." Tara's eyes hardened. "Let him come." In the days following the raid at the docks, Tara couldn't shake the feeling of being stalked. Everywhere she went, she felt Ramos' presence, an invisible shadow, lurking just out of sight. He was hunting her now, she knew that much. And the only way to end it was to face him head-on. The investigation into the mole continued, but the trail had gone cold. Davis had been the obvious suspect, but now, it seemed like there was someone else. Someone higher up. The thought gnawed at Tara's mind, how deep did the corruption go? Late one evening, as Tara sat in her apartment, reviewing the latest reports, her phone rang. It was Jackson. "Tara, we've got a lead," he said, his voice tense. "Ramos is meeting with someone tonight. We don't know who, but it's happening in an abandoned hotel downtown. We need to move fast." Tara's heart raced. This could be the break they needed. She grabbed her gun and jacket, moving quickly out the door. The streets of Atlanta were quiet as she made her way downtown, her mind focused on the task ahead. As she arrived at the hotel, the air felt thick with tension. The building was dark, its windows shattered and covered in graffiti. It was the perfect place for a clandestine meeting. Jackson and the team were already in position, waiting for her signal. Tara moved in, her gun drawn as she entered the hotel. The lobby was eerily silent, the floor littered with debris. She crept forward, her footsteps barely making a sound as she headed toward the back of the building. Her ears strained for any noise, any sign of movement. Then, she heard it, voices, faint but distinct, coming from one of the upper floors. Tara motioned for her team to follow as they moved toward the staircase. The voices grew louder as they ascended, and Tara's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. Ramos was here. As they reached the top floor, Tara caught sight of the meeting through a cracked door. Ramos stood in the center of the room, flanked by several of his men. And across from him was someone Tara hadn't expected to see, a high-ranking FBI official. Her blood ran cold. This was bigger than she had imagined. The corruption went all the way to the top. Tara signaled to Jackson, who moved into position. They were ready to take them down. FBI. Don't move. Tara shouted, bursting into the room. Ramos didn't flinch. He turned to her slowly, a cold smile spreading across his face. Agent Johnson. Right on time. The room erupted into chaos as Ramos' men drew their weapons. Gunfire echoed through the building as Tara and her team moved in, taking down Ramos' guards with precision. But as the dust settled, Ramos was nowhere to be found. Tara cursed under her breath, scanning the room for any sign of him. But he had vanished, slipping through their grasp yet again. As the team secured the scene, Jackson approached Tara, his expression grim. He's gone. But we've got the official. That's something. Tara nodded, but the victory felt hollow. Ramos was still out there, still hunting her. And now, with the revelation of corruption within the FBI, Tara knew the fight was far from over. We'll get him, Jackson said, his voice filled with determination. One way or another. Tara's eyes hardened as she looked out into the night. Ramos had slipped away again, but this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. The tension continues to rise as Tara inches closer to uncovering the full extent of Ramos' network. With corruption spreading within the FBI, the stakes have never been higher, and Tara must navigate a web of deceit and danger as she hunts down the man who has made her his target. The revelation that a high-ranking FBI official had been in cahoots with Ramos rattled Tara to her core. She had always known that corruption could seep into any organization, but to witness it at such a high level shook her trust in the agency she had dedicated her life to. As the night wore on and the captured official was taken into custody, Tara sat in the briefing room, her thoughts swirling. Jackson walked in, his face grim but determined. We've got the official, but Ramos is still out there. He's slipping through our fingers every time. Tara nodded, her hands clenched into fists. He's more slippery than anyone we've ever dealt with. But now we know, it goes deeper than just the streets. He's playing a bigger game, and we've been chasing shadows. Jackson sighed. We need to tread carefully. We don't know how many more people in the Bureau are involved. For all we know, there are others keeping Ramos one step ahead of us. The thought made Tara's stomach churn. She'd always believed in the FBI's mission to protect and serve, but now she was questioning everyone around her. Who could she trust? Was anyone on her team compromised? We need to start from the inside out, Tara said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. We need to root out anyone else who's been compromised by Ramos. Jackson nodded. Agreed. But we can't do it alone. We'll need to bring in outside help. Someone with fresh eyes, who isn't tainted by the internal politics. Tara's mind raced through a list of potential allies. There was one name that stood out, Special Agent Alexis Green, a colleague who had been transferred out of Atlanta years ago after investigating a high-profile corruption case. Green had a reputation for being relentless and incorruptible, qualities that would be crucial in this new phase of the investigation. I'll reach out to Green, Tara said decisively. She's been working on similar cases, and she's someone we can trust. Jackson looked relieved. Good call. We need someone with her expertise. I'll make sure we have everything prepped for when she arrives. As the days passed, Tara's every move was calculated. She had learned her lesson after Ramos' near misses, and she wasn't about to let him slip through the cracks again. She worked tirelessly with Jackson, building a case not only against Ramos but also against the corrupt official they had arrested. Every document, every conversation, every lead was analyzed with surgical precision. When Green arrived, the atmosphere shifted. Tall and no-nonsense, with sharp green eyes that seemed to miss nothing, she immediately took control of the investigation. She and Tara clicked instantly, their shared sense of justice bonding them together. Green wasted no time diving into the investigation. We're dealing with a cartel that's been emboldened by their infiltration into law enforcement, she said as she reviewed the files. Ramos has been playing this game for years, and he's become a master at it. But now, we hit him where it hurts. Tara leaned forward, her eyes locked on Green. How do we get ahead of him? Every time we've made a move, he's known in advance. Green smiled grimly. We changed the rules of the game. We feed him false information. Tara's brow furrowed. A decoy operation? Exactly, Green replied. We let him believe we're going after a different target, something big, and we make sure the information leaks through channels we suspect are compromised. He'll bite, and when he does, we'll be waiting. It was risky, but it was the best shot they had. Tara knew that Ramos was careful, but he was also prideful. If they dangled a big enough prize in front of him, he wouldn't be able to resist. They spent days meticulously crafting the fake operation. It was designed to appear as though the FBI had uncovered a massive shipment of drugs that Ramos was planning to move through a hidden network in the city. They leaked the details through the compromised officials' known contacts, ensuring that the information would make its way back to Ramos. Then, they waited. The night of the operation, the tension was palpable. Tara, Jackson, Green, and a team of agents were positioned around the docks, the same location they had hit weeks earlier. This time, they weren't after a shipment, they were after Ramos himself. Tara crouched behind a stack of crates, her pulse quickening as the minutes ticked by. Through her earpiece, she heard the low murmur of voices as the team communicated their positions. Do you think he'll come? Jackson asked quietly from beside her. He'll come, Tara said, her voice firm. He's too arrogant not to. Suddenly, movement caught her eye. A group of men appeared at the far end of the dock, moving in quickly but cautiously. Tara's heart skipped a beat as she spotted the men at the center of the group, Ramos. He was here. Targets in sight, Tara whispered into her mic, prepare to move on my signal. She watched as Ramos and his men moved closer, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of the dock lights. Her hands tightened around her gun as she prepared to give the order. This was it. After months of cat and mouse, they finally had him. Now, she whispered. The team moved as one, emerging from the shadows and surrounding Ramos and his men in a matter of seconds. Shouts rang out as guns were drawn and the cartel members were forced to the ground. Ramos, caught off guard, froze for a split second before his eyes locked on Tara. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face. Agent Johnson, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. You just never give up, do you? Tara approached him, her gun still trained on him. Not when it comes to scum like you. Ramos chuckled, though there was no humor in his eyes. You think you've won, don't you? Tara stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. You're going away for a long time, Ramos. This is the end of the line. Ramos' smile faltered for the first time. The arrogance that had always been his trademark was gone, replaced by something darker, fear. As the agents moved in to cuff him, Tara couldn't help but feel a sense of victory wash over her. Ramos was finally in custody, his reign of terror over. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The corruption in the bureau ran deep, and Ramos wasn't the only player in this twisted game. There were still battles to be fought, still enemies lurking in the shadows. As Ramos was led away in handcuffs, Tara exchanged a glance with Jackson and Green. They had won this round, but the war was far from over. The day after Ramos' arrest should have been a celebration, but for Tara, it only signaled the start of a new chapter. As she sat in her office, her mind was already racing with thoughts of what came next. Ramos was in custody, but the bigger threat, the network of corruption within the FBI, was still at large. Tara's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Green. We need to talk. Green's voice was serious, tinged with an urgency Tara had never heard before. Meet me in my office in 10, Tara replied, already sensing that this conversation would shift the entire case. When Green arrived, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She placed a file on Tara's desk, thick with documents and surveillance photos. This is what we're up against, Green said, her tone sharp. Ramos wasn't working alone. He had someone high up feeding him information, and this person is still out there. Tara's heart sank as she flipped through the file. The photos showed meetings between Ramos and various high-ranking officials, some of whom Tara recognized from past investigations. This wasn't just a mole, it was an entire network of corruption. It goes deeper than we thought, Green continued. We're looking at a full-scale operation, with ties not only to the FBI but also to local law enforcement, judges, and even politicians. Tara's mind reeled. The depth of the corruption was staggering. How do we bring them down? Green's eyes darkened. We start by dismantling their power structure. We need to gather more evidence, expose their connections, and build a case so strong that they can't escape it. Tara nodded, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about bringing down Ramos anymore. It was about cleaning house, rooting out the rot that had infected the very heart of the justice system. We need to move quickly, Tara said. The longer we wait, the more they'll cover their tracks. Green agreed. I've already started gathering intel. We'll need to be smart about this. If they suspect we're onto them, they'll shut us down before we even get close. Tara took a deep breath, the weight of the task ahead settling on her shoulders. But she wasn't afraid. She had fought too hard and come too far to back down now. The battle had only just begun. In the days following Ramos' arrest, the atmosphere within the FBI shifted dramatically. Conversations were muted, and every hallway seemed to hum with tension. Tara couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were always on her, watching her every move. It was no longer just about the cartel or even Ramos. There was a silent conspiracy in play, one that threatened to tear the agency apart. Tara spent hours in her office, combing through files with Green, piecing together the web of corruption. Every lead seemed to point back to the same conclusion: Ramos wasn't the mastermind. He was a pawn in a much larger game. And the players behind the scenes were more powerful than anyone had realized. Jackson walked in, shutting the door behind him. I just heard from a reliable source. There's a lot of chatter upstairs. People are getting nervous. Tara looked up from the documents. Nervous about what? About you, Jackson replied, his tone grim. Word's gotten out that you're digging into things. Some of the higher-ups aren't happy. They think you're stirring the pot. Tara frowned. Stirring the pot? They're the ones who let it boil over. I'm just trying to clean up the mess. Jackson shook his head. You're not hearing me, Tara. They're circling the wagons. They know you're getting close to something, and they're trying to shut you down. The weight of his words hit Tara like a punch to the gut. She had expected resistance, but not this soon. What do you suggest we do? Jackson glanced at Green, who had been quietly listening from the corner of the room. We keep going, but we're smarter about it. We don't let them know how much we've uncovered. If they think we're closing in, they'll bury us. Green nodded, her expression as hard as steel. We've got a good start, but we need more. We need something undeniable, something they can't cover up. Tara leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. What about the surveillance footage we've been gathering? There has to be something in there that connects the dots. Green reached for a USB drive on the desk. I've been going through it, and I found something interesting. Ramos wasn't just meeting with officials. He was meeting with a judge, one who's presided over several cases connected to the cartel. Tara's eyes widened. A judge. Green nodded. If we can prove that the judge is involved, we'll have a direct link between the cartel and the justice system. It's a game changer. Jackson crossed his arms. But how do we prove it? The judge isn't going to incriminate himself. Tara tapped her fingers on the desk, thinking. We'll have to get creative. Maybe we can bait him, make him think he's safe while we gather enough evidence to take him down. Green smirked. A decoy operation, just like with Ramos? Tara nodded. But this time, we need to be even more careful. They're watching us. If they suspect anything, it's over. The plan began to take shape over the next few days. Tara and Green worked tirelessly, setting up a sting operation that would put the judge in a compromising position. They leaked carefully curated information to make it seem like the FBI was backing off the investigation, hoping to lull the judge and his associates into a false sense of security. Meanwhile, Jackson kept his ear to the ground, listening for any signs that their plan was being uncovered. Tensions were running high, and every interaction with their colleagues felt like a potential threat. Tara knew that any slip-up could cost them everything. The day of the operation arrived, and Tara's nerves were on edge. They had chosen a discreet location, a high-end restaurant where the judge was known to conduct his less-than-legal business dealings. Tara and Green were positioned nearby, monitoring the situation through hidden cameras and listening devices. As the minutes ticked by, Tara's pulse quickened. The judge arrived, accompanied by two men Tara didn't recognize. They sat at a secluded table, speaking in hushed tones, but the microphones picked up every word. Green's eyes narrowed as she listened. They're talking about payouts. The judge is taking bribes to ensure certain cases go in favor of the cartel. Tara's heart pounded. This was it, the smoking gun they needed. Get ready, Green whispered. Once we have him on tape, we move in. Tara watched the screen intently as the conversation continued. The judge grew bolder, openly discussing his involvement in fixing cases. It was more than enough to indict him. Now, Tara said quietly into her mic. The operation team moved swiftly, surrounding the restaurant and entering quietly. Within moments, the judge and his associates were in custody, their shocked expressions captured on camera for the world to see. Tara felt a surge of triumph as she watched the scene unfold. They had done it. They had brought down one of the key players in the corrupt network. But even as the victory washed over her, she knew this was just the beginning. As the judge was led away in handcuffs, Tara exchanged a look with Green and Jackson. They had won this battle, but the war against corruption was far from over. The fallout from the judge's arrest was swift and brutal. Within hours, news outlets were running stories about the corruption scandal, and the public was outraged. The FBI was thrust into the spotlight, with calls for investigations into how such deep-rooted corruption had gone unnoticed for so long. Tara sat in her office, watching the news coverage with mixed emotions. On one hand, she was relieved that their hard work was paying off. On the other, she knew that the pressure was about to intensify tenfold. The higher-ups were already scrambling to contain the damage, and Tara had no doubt that they would try to pin the blame on her if things went south. Jackson walked in, his face grim. You need to be careful, Tara. People are looking for someone to blame, and you're the one who started all of this. Tara nodded, her jaw tight. I know. But I'm not backing down. Not now. Green entered the room, holding a file. We've got more. The judge wasn't just taking bribes, he was actively helping Ramos expand his operations. This goes all the way up. Tara's heart sank as she looked through the file. The names listed inside were some of the most powerful people in the city, judges, politicians, even law enforcement officers. This was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. We're going to need more than just this, Tara said quietly. We need to expose every single person involved. This has to end. Green nodded. Agreed. But it won't be easy. They're going to come after us with everything they've got. Tara's eyes hardened with resolve. Let them. We're not stopping until the truth comes out. The next phase of the investigation would be the most dangerous yet. Tara knew that the people they were up against would do anything to protect their power. But she wasn't afraid. She had come too far to turn back now. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the streets, Tara prepared herself for the battles that lay ahead. The war against corruption was far from over, but she was ready to fight. No matter the cost. In the days following the judge's arrest, the corridors of the FBI felt colder, more hostile. Tara Johnson was no longer seen as just a brilliant agent, she had become a lightning rod for controversy. Whispers followed her wherever she went, and her superiors started avoiding eye contact altogether. She knew it was only a matter of time before the storm hit. The investigation had gotten too close to powerful people, and now those people were beginning to push back. Tara sat in her office, poring over case files and evidence, trying to fortify their position. But no amount of preparation could shield her from what was coming. Jackson entered the room, shutting the door firmly behind him. His face was tense. Tara, we've got a problem. She looked up from her desk, already knowing what he was going to say. What now? Jackson dropped a thick folder on her desk. Internal affairs. They're launching an investigation into you, officially. The word is that some of the higher-ups are saying you overstepped, that you acted without clearance on the judge's arrest. Tara frowned, flipping through the folder. That's ridiculous. We had everything lined up. We did it by the book. Jackson sighed. Doesn't matter. They're trying to frame this as a rogue operation. There's talk that you're too aggressive, that you've been ignoring protocols. Tara could feel the anger rising in her chest. Of course, they're saying that. We're getting too close to the truth, and now they're scrambling to protect themselves. Green appeared in the doorway, her expression just as grim. She's right. I've been hearing the same from my sources. They're preparing to throw you under the bus, Tara. If this investigation turns against you, they'll discredit everything we've worked for. Tara clenched her fists. So what's the plan? Sit back and let them smear me? Green shook her head. We're not going to let that happen. But we need to be smart about this. They're expecting you to fight back publicly, which will only make things worse. Jackson added, we have to focus on building our case stronger. We have enough to implicate more people, but we need something bigger, something that blows this wide open. Tara leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of it all on her shoulders. She had worked her entire career to uphold the law, to fight for justice. Now, she was facing the very system she had sworn to protect. But she wasn't going to give up. Not when they were so close. I'll handle internal affairs, Tara said, her voice resolute. But we need more evidence. Green, Jackson, keep digging. There has to be something we're missing. Green nodded. There is one thing. I've been tracking some offshore accounts linked to the judge. I think Ramos and the cartel might have used him to launder money through a series of shell companies. If we can trace the funds, we can tie them directly to the people backing him. Tara's eyes lit up with interest. Follow the money. That's the key. Jackson leaned forward. But it won't be easy. We're going to need access to financial records, and that means getting clearance from people who might be part of the conspiracy. Tara smirked. Then we don't ask for permission. We find another way in. The three of them spent the next few hours devising a plan. They would use a combination of subpoenaed records, anonymous tips, and a few strategically placed leaks to keep the investigation moving forward, even as internal affairs tried to shut it down. It was a risky strategy, but they were running out of time. By the end of the day, Tara knew that they had to act quickly. Her enemies weren't just in the cartel, they were in the agency itself. Every day that passed brought more pressure, more scrutiny. But Tara was no stranger to adversity. As the sun set outside her window, casting the room in shadows, she sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the upcoming battle settle over her. Let them come, she whispered to herself. I'm ready. The next morning, Tara received a call from the office of Director Simmons, the head of the FBI. It was a summons she had been expecting but dreading. Simmons was known for his no-nonsense approach and his reputation for protecting the agency's interests above all else. If he was involved, things were about to get serious. Tara entered his office, her nerves steeled for what was to come. Simmons sat behind his massive desk, his expression unreadable. A manila folder lay open in front of him, and Tara could see her name on several of the documents. Agent Johnson, Simmons began, his tone neutral. You've been making quite a few waves lately. Tara remained calm. I'm just doing my job, Director. Simmons raised an eyebrow. Your job, as you see it, seems to be causing problems for this agency. I have multiple reports from internal affairs suggesting that your methods have been questionable. Tara met his gaze, refusing to back down. With all due respect, sir, the only questionable methods I've seen are those of the people we've been investigating. If I hadn't pushed as hard as I did, we wouldn't have exposed the corruption that's been festering here. Simmons closed the folder, leaning back in his chair. I'm not here to debate your tactics, Agent Johnson. What I am here to discuss is how this situation is going to end. We have a choice to make, either we handle this internally and quietly, or you continue down this path, and things get much messier for you and for the Bureau. Tara could feel the trap closing in around her. Simmons was offering her an out, take the fall quietly, let the investigation die, and in return, she'd avoid the public spectacle of being dragged through the mud. But at what cost? I appreciate the offer, Director, Tara said, her voice steady, but I'm not going to stop. There are too many people counting on me to see this through. I'm not interested in protecting anyone who's been part of this corruption. Simmons' expression hardened. Be careful, Johnson. You're treading on dangerous ground. Tara stood her ground. Dangerous ground is the only kind I know, sir. Simmons watched her for a long moment, then nodded curtly. You're dismissed. As Tara left the office, she felt a surge of adrenaline. She had just refused a direct offer from one of the most powerful men in the agency. There was no turning back now. She was all in, and so were Green and Jackson. But now, they were on borrowed time. As Tara regrouped with Green and Jackson, the investigation into the judge's financial dealings began to unravel a web of deceit far more complex than they had anticipated. The shell companies led to a network of influential individuals, politicians, CEOs, and even law enforcement officers, who had all benefited from the cartel's operations. One name, however, stood out above the rest, a name that sent chills down Tara's spine. "Are you sure about this?" Tara asked Green, staring at the report in disbelief. Green nodded grimly. "There's no doubt. The money trail leads directly to Director Simmons." Jackson cursed under his breath. "The head of the FBI is in bed with the cartel?" Tara's mind raced. This changed everything. Simmons had been orchestrating the cover-up all along. That's why he had tried to offer her a way out. He was protecting himself. "We need to move fast," Tara said, her voice filled with urgency. "Simmons is going to realize we're onto him soon, and when he does, he'll come after us with everything he's got." Jackson looked at her, determination in his eyes. "Then let's take him down before he takes us out." The next phase of their investigation wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about survival. Tara, Green, and Jackson knew that confronting Simmons meant going against the highest levels of the FBI. They were about to make themselves targets. Their every move would be scrutinized, their every decision questioned. But they had come too far to back down now. Their first step was to gather irrefutable evidence of Simmons' involvement with the cartel. Green worked tirelessly to follow the financial trails, linking Simmons to illegal transactions, while Jackson tapped into his network to find potential whistleblowers who might have been silenced by Simmons' power. But as they dug deeper, it became clear that they were being watched. One evening, Tara returned to her apartment to find the door slightly ajar. Her heart raced as she cautiously entered, gun drawn. Inside, nothing appeared to be out of place, but she knew better. Someone had been there, sending her a message. She quickly called Jackson and Green, warning them to stay vigilant. They were under siege, both from within the FBI and from unseen forces outside. "What do we do now?" Jackson asked, his voice tense over the phone. "We don't stop," Tara said firmly. "We keep going. But we're going to have to be smarter than ever. We can't trust anyone." For the next several days, they operated like fugitives within their own agency, moving in secret, communicating in code, and using back channels to avoid detection. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, and they knew that one wrong step could bring everything crashing down. As they closed in on Simmons, Tara received a tip from an unexpected source, Mitchell, the young officer who had helped her during her initial arrest by Daniels. He had risen through the ranks quietly, and now he was reaching out with vital information. "Tara," Mitchell said over a secure line, "I've been keeping my head down, but I've seen things that point to Simmons. He's not just covering up for the cartel. He's directly involved in their operations. I can help you, but it's going to cost me everything." Tara didn't hesitate. "We're in this together. Whatever it takes, we're bringing him down." With Mitchell's help, they obtained documents, audio recordings, and financial records that linked Simmons to the cartel in ways that even he couldn't deny. It was a goldmine of evidence, but getting it out would be the hardest part. They needed to blow the whistle, but it had to be done carefully. Tara, Green, and Jackson devised a plan, leaking the evidence to trusted media outlets while simultaneously filing formal complaints within the Justice Department. They would hit Simmons from every angle, leaving him no room to maneuver. But they knew Simmons wouldn't go down without a fight. The final showdown was fast approaching, and as the walls closed in around them, Tara prepared herself for what could be her last stand. The night before they were set to go public, Tara sat in her office, going over the evidence one last time. The weight of what they were about to do settled heavily on her shoulders. They were about to expose the head of the FBI as a criminal, an act that would shake the very foundations of the agency. Green and Jackson were with her, going over the final details of the plan. "You sure we're ready for this?" Jackson asked, his voice tight with tension. Tara nodded. "We don't have a choice. It's now or never." Green tapped a few keys on her laptop, sending the final files to the media outlets. "It's done. There's no going back now." Just then, Tara's phone buzzed. It was Mitchell. "I just heard from one of my contacts. he said, his voice urgent. Simmons knows what you're doing. He's coming after you, and he's bringing reinforcements. You need to get out of there. Tara's heart pounded. How long do we have? Not long, Mitchell replied. Get out now. Tara turned to Green and Jackson. We need to move. Simmons is coming. They grabbed their things and bolted from the office, hearts racing as they made their way through the quiet hallways of the FBI building. Tara's mind was spinning. The evidence was out, but now they had to survive long enough to see it through. As they reached the parking garage, Tara saw several black SUVs pulling in, their headlights cutting through the dimly lit space. Simmons people, Jackson muttered. We're trapped. Tara scanned the area, her mind racing. They needed a way out, but it seemed like every exit was blocked. Panic threatened to rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. We'll split up, Tara said, her voice steady. They can't catch all of us. Green nodded. I'll head for the south exit. You two go for the west. If we make it out, we'll meet up at the safe house. They quickly split, running in opposite directions as Simmons' men closed in. Tara and Jackson sprinted toward the west exit, but as they rounded a corner, they found themselves face to face with a group of armed agents. There was no way out. Tara raised her hands, her heart pounding. We're not here to fight. One of the agents stepped forward. Director Simmons wants a word. Tara and Jackson were led into a darkened room, their hands cuffed in front of them. Simmons stood at the far end, his face twisted in a smug grin. You really thought you could take me down, didn't you? Simmons said, his voice dripping with contempt. Tara met his gaze without flinching. We already did. The evidence is out. It's over. Simmons chuckled. You think leaking a few files to the press is going to stop me? I run this agency, Agent Johnson. I control what gets seen and what gets buried. Tara's stomach twisted. She had known Simmons would be ruthless, but hearing him admit his control over the FBI chilled her to the core. You're a fool if you think you can outsmart me, Simmons continued. I have connections that go far beyond this agency. You and your friends are nothing more than pawns in a game you don't even understand. Tara clenched her fists, her mind racing. She couldn't let Simmons win. Not after everything they had been through. What do you want? Tara asked, her voice cold. Simmons smiled. I'm willing to make a deal. You walk away from this, stop digging, stop causing trouble, and I'll let you and your friends go. No charges, no retaliation. You get to keep your career, and I get to keep mine. Tara felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. Simmons was offering her an easy way out, but at the cost of everything she stood for. She had spent her entire life fighting for justice, and now she was being asked to betray that for her own survival. I can't do that, Tara said, her voice firm. Simmons' smile faded. You're making a mistake. Tara met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. No, you are. At that moment, the door burst open, and several agents from the Justice Department stormed into the room. Simmons' face twisted in shock as they moved toward him. Director Simmons, one of the agents said, holding up a badge, you're under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Simmons' face drained of color as he was handcuffed and led away. Tara stood silently, her heart pounding in her chest. It was over. They had won. The days following Simmons' arrest were a whirlwind of media coverage, internal investigations, and public outcry. The FBI was rocked by the scandal, and a wave of resignations and firings followed as more people were implicated in the corruption. Tara, Green, and Jackson were hailed as heroes for their role in exposing the truth, but the victory was bittersweet. The agency they had dedicated their lives to was deeply broken, and it would take years to rebuild. Tara sat in her office, staring out the window at the city below. She had won the battle, but the scars of the fight ran deep. She had lost friends, faced betrayal, and had come close to losing everything she held dear. But in the end, justice had prevailed. Green knocked on the door and entered. The press wants another interview. You ready for round 2? Tara smiled tiredly. I think I've had enough of the spotlight for one lifetime. Jackson appeared behind Green, a grin on his face. Well, you better get used to it. You're the new face of the FBI. Tara shook her head. I'm just glad it's over. But as she looked at her friends, she knew the fight for justice would never truly be over. There would always be new challenges, new battles to fight. And as long as there was corruption, she would be there to confront it. Tara stood up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. They had survived the storm, and now it was time to rebuild. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Tara was ready for whatever came next. If you liked this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. And let us know in the comments what you'd like to see in the next chapter of Tara's journey.